Okay, so I'm going to switch over from facilitator mode to presenter mode and present sort of what we consider to be one of the layers of student learning objectives. As I mentioned, we have Chris from the South Carolina Department of Education and Joanne from Austin. I'm going to be presenting sort of the national view of student learning objectives, and then we'll drill down to the state level and then a district experience. So first, I want to quickly define what student learning objectives, or SLOs, are. Student learning objectives are measurable, long-term academic goals informed by available student data that teachers create, or sometimes that are created in a teacher team or at a district level. Teacher teams or teachers set these goals at the beginning of the year for all students or for subgroups of students. We'll talk in a couple of minutes about all of the different variations of what student learning objectives are. But I wanted to sort of mention that student learning objectives were initially used sort of more broadly as a response to VAM or student growth percentiles, because the number of teachers impacted by state tests is actually relatively small compared to the total number of teachers. And so one of the things that student learning objectives can accomplish is that they can help in the evaluation of teachers from a wide range of grade levels and subjects. These teachers don't have to be tied to state tests. Individual teachers can be assessed, as well as teacher teams, and they can also be used and are being used currently for principal and other administrator evaluations. So, how are student learning objectives, or SLOs, developed? This really varies state to state or district to district, depending on the model that's being used. Two of the most common tools that are used are an SLO template or an SLO checklist or rubric. And in many states and districts, they use a combination of these things to help teachers or teacher teams or principals develop their student learning objectives. In general terms, although it does vary state to state, the templates or the checklists include a number of different sections, including sort of student baseline data. So at a teacher level, this might be some pre-assessment data, or it may be data about the student population, such as free and reduced lunch levels. Any students with IEPs are generally noted. Student population, which again goes into the number of students that will be covered by a student learning objective, whether it's one class that a teacher teaches, or maybe all sections of one course that a teacher teaches. Generally, it'll include the interval of instruction, and as I mentioned earlier, SLOs are viewed as a longer-term set of academic goals for students and for teachers to measure. So these are different than sort of the weekly goals or monthly goals or even quarterly goals that teachers might have. Generally speaking, they're viewed as much longer term, so for the entire semester, for a semester-long class, or for the bulk of the year, and they refer to that as the interval of instruction. Teachers or teacher teams, or again, depending on the sort of local business rules, then identify the standards and content that are going to be the focus of the student learning objective. They identify which assessments are going to be used, both the pre-assessment, post-assessment, and any formative assessments that might be used. And then teachers or teacher teams are asked to develop growth targets, and that is based on the pre-assessment data. Where do they think students are going to land by the end of the interval of instruction? Again, these templates change depending on which district or state we're talking about, but in general, most of the templates that we've seen when we look nationwide have some sort of rationale for the growth targets, and in some states and locations, there's also a section for instructional strategies. So what does the SLO evaluation cycle look like? Well, it starts with teachers doing what most teachers do anyways, and that is identifying which students they teach and where those students are starting out the year. Then teachers collect data and they identify the key outcomes that they want for the students, which standards they're going to focus on, and they develop the SLO. Hey, Jackie, can we make that full screen, please? After the SLO is written, generally there is an approval process. Again, this varies district to district or state to state, but oftentimes the approval process includes a teacher meeting with the principal to get them to sign off on the SLO plan, to review the standards as well as the growth targets for the students. And then teachers do what teachers have always done, which is they teach, and they create formative and some shorter term summative assessments to check to make sure students are on track to meet their growth targets. Depending on the state and district, mid-course check-ins are done. Sometimes those are optional, depending on the district. Sometimes they are mandatory. In some of those meetings, depending again on the business rules, teachers may be able to adjust their growth targets depending on how on track students are to meeting those growth targets. Some districts have a mid-course check-in when they don't allow teachers to make adjustments to the growth targets. It's just a way to make sure that teachers are sort of focusing on the content that they have identified. At the end of the interval of instruction, teachers give some type of post-assessment. There is a pretty wide range of what's acceptable to use in a student learning objective, and we'll talk a little bit more about the assessments that get used, but basically teachers collect data and see how much did students grow while they were with me. They reflect on that process after recording the data and reflecting on what they believe students were going to be able to achieve at the beginning of the year, the type of growth. And then they meet with their administrators to review those results. And in many places, that's where a final evaluation score is created. So this is sort of the overall cycle. Again, it really does vary state to state and district to district. Where did SLOs sort of come from? Well, there are a couple of places where they had been adopted a number of years ago, including Austin, Texas, which is why we're so glad Joanne is here. She's going to talk a little bit about the historical nature of SLOs within Austin. But really, they came into their own based on the ESSA waivers that many states were asked to sign on to. States started to use SLOs again as sort of a reaction to the conundrum of how do we assess the impact of teachers on their students when we don't have state test data to go on. And I will just say that as people I'm sure are aware, now that ESSA is the law of the land, a number of states are reconsidering what needs to be included in their educator evaluation systems and are taking a look at both the promise of SLOs and some of the challenges of SLOs to see what types of changes in the SLO process they'd like to have for their states. One important note, SLO use varies considerably throughout the nation. And so what is sort of the spectrum of how SLOs have been interpreted? It really varies. And I actually will say that this sort of spectrum that you see in front of you starts with type 1, where all of the control is set at the teacher level. Teachers decide the content, teachers decide what assessments will be used, what growth targets are appropriate, what type of teaching will be focused on, and that really focuses a lot on trusting the teachers to make sure that they are having rigorous yet attainable growth targets. And as we move up through where we go from sort of increasing teacher agency to increasing SLO compatibility or comparability, we see that some districts have taken sort of a more controlled approach to SLOs where they decide what the focus for the student learning objectives are at each grade and subject area. They decide what the pre and post tests will be like, and the district will often, in cases where the district is sort of exerting this increased comparability, they will actually decide what the growth targets are. I will also say